Welcome to part 7. We are starting from page 59, Descartes. Just so everybody knows, I can't really see the chat. Just getting adjusted here. The constructive movement of the 17th century thought concentrated itself on the problems, let me restart. The constructive movement of 17th century thought constructed itself on the problems of natural science and left those of history on one side. Descartes, like Bacon, distinguished poetry, history, and philosophy, and added a fourth term, divinity. But of these four things, he applied his new method to philosophy alone, with its three main divisions of mathematics, physics, and metaphysics. For it was only here that he hoped to attain secure and certain knowledge. Poetry, he said, was more of a gift of nature than a discipline. Divinity depended on the faith and revelation. History, however interesting and instructive, however valuable towards the information of practical attitude in life, could not claim truth. For the events in which it described never happened exactly as it described them. Thus, the reformation of knowledge which Descartes envisaged was, and actually did bring about, was designed to contribute nothing to historical thought, because he did not believe history to be, strictly speaking, a branch of knowledge at all. It was worthwhile to look more closely at the paragraph on history in the first part of Discourse on Method. I thought by now that I had spent enough labor on the study of ancient languages, on the reading of ancient authors and their histories and narratives. To live with men of an earlier age is like traveling in foreign lands. It is useful to know something of the manners of other people in order to judge them more impartially of our own, and not despise and ridicule whatever differs from them, like men who have never been outside of their own native country. But those who travel too long end by these strangers in their own homes, and those who study too curiously the actions of antiquity are ignorant of what is done among ourselves today. Moreover, these narratives of what is done Moreover, these narratives tell of things that cannot have happened as they have really taken place, and thus invite us to attempt what is beyond our powers or to hope for what is beyond our fate. Even histories, though they be true, and neither exaggerating nor altering the value of things, omit circumstances of a meaner and less dignified kind in order to become more worthy of a reader's attention. Hence, the things which they describe never happen exactly as they describe them, and the men who try to model their own acts upon them are prone to madness of romantic paladins and meditate hyperbolic deeds. Descartes here makes 4 points, which it is well to distinguish. 1. Historical escapism. The historian is a traveler who, by living away from home, becomes a stranger in his own age. 2. Historical Pyrrhonism. Historical narratives are not trustworthy accounts of the past. 3. Anti-utilitarian idea of history. Untrustworthy narratives cannot really assist us to understand what is possible and thus to act effectively in the present. 4. History as fantasy building. The way in which historians, even at best, distort the past is by making it appear more splendid than it really was. 1. One answer to the escapist view of history would be to show that the historian can genuinely see into the past only so far as he stands firmly rooted in the present. That is, his business is not to leap clean out of his own period of history, but to be, in every respect, a man of his age, and to see the past as it appears from the standpoint of that age. This is actually the true answer. But in order that it should be given, it was necessary for the theory of knowledge to advance farther than Descartes took it. It was not until the time of Kant that philosophers conceived the idea of knowledge as direct to an object relative to the knower's own point of view. The Kantian Copernican revolution contained implicitly, though Kant himself did not work it out, a theory of how historical knowledge is possible, not only without the historian's abandoning the standpoint of his own age, but precisely because he does not abandon that standpoint. 2. To say that historical narratives relate the events that cannot to relate events that cannot have happened is to say that we have some criterion, other than the narratives which lead us by which to judge what could have happened. Descartes here is enumerating a genuinely critical attitude in history which, if fully developed, would be the answer to his own objection. 3. The Renaissance scholars, in reviving many elements of the Greco-Roman conception of history, had revived the idea that its value was a practical value, instructing men in the art of politics and practical life. This idea was inevitable so long as people could find no theoretical basis for the alternative belief that its value was rhetorical and consisted in truth. Descartes was quite right to reject it. He was in fact anticipating Hegel's remark in introduction to his philosophy of history that the practical lesson of history is that no one ever learns anything from history. Love that. But he did not see that the historical work of his own day, in the hands of men like Buchanan and Grotius, and still more of others in the generation then beginning, like Tillemont and the Bollandist scholars, was actuated by a sheer desire for truth, and that the pragmatic conception which he was criticizing was dead by the time that he wrote it. 4. In saying that historical narratives exaggerate the grandeur and splendor of the past, Descartes was actually propounding a criterion by which they could be criticized, and by which the truth they concealed or distorted could be rediscovered. If he had continued in that vein, he might have laid down a method or code of rules for historical criticism. Actually, this is one of the rules laid down at the beginning of the next century by Vico. But Descartes did not realize this, because his intellectual interests were so definitely oriented towards mathematics and physics that when writing about history, he could mistake a fertile suggestion towards the improvement of historical method for a demonstration that there was no such improvement possible. Thus the attitude of Descartes towards history was curiously ambiguous. So far as his intention went, his works intended to have thrown doubt on its value. However, that value was conceived because he meant to direct people away from it and towards exact science. In the 19th century, science went on its own way independently of philosophy, because of the post-Kantian idealists had taken up an increasingly skeptical attitude towards it, and the breach has only begun to be healed in our own time. This estrangement was exactly paralleled by the between history and philosophy in the 17th century, which was due to a parallel cause, the historical skepticism of Descartes. Subsection 6. Cartesian historiography. In point of fact, Descartes' skepticism by no means discouraged the historians. Rather, they behaved as though they had taken it as a challenge, an invitation to go away and work out their own methods for themselves, satisfying themselves that critical history was possible, and then come back to the philosophers with a new world of knowledge in their hands. During the latter half of the 17th century, a new school of historical thought arose, which, in spite of the paradox contained in this phase, might be called Cartesian historiography, and somewhat as the classical French drama of the same period has been called a school of Cartesian poetry. I call it Cartesian historiography because it was based, like the Cartesian philosophy, on systemic skepticism and thoroughgoing recognition of critical principles. The main idea of this new school was that the testimony of written authorities must not be accepted without submitting it to a process of criticism based on at least 3 rules of method. 1. Descartes' own implicit rule, that no authority must induce us to believe what we know cannot have happened. 2. The rule that the different authorities must be confronted with each other and harmonized. 3. The rule that written authorities must be checked by the use of non-literary evidence. History, thus conceived, was still based on written authorities, or what Bacon would have called memory. But historians now but historians were now learning to treat their authorities in a thoroughly critical spirit. As examples of this school, I have already mentioned Tillemont and the Bollandists. Tillemont's History of the Roman Emperors was the first attempt to write Roman history with systemic attention to reconciling the statements of different authorities. The Bollandists, a school of Benedictine scholars, set themselves to write the lives of the saints on a critical basis, purging away all exaggeratedly miraculous elements and going more deeply than anyone had hitherto done into the problem of the sources and the way in which traditions had grown up. It is to this period, and especially to the Bollandists, that we owe the idea of dissecting a tradition, allowing for the distortion of the medium through which it has reached us, and thus getting rid once and for all of the old dilemma between either accepting it en bloc as true or rejecting it as false. At the same time, detailed studies were being made of the possibilities of coins, inscriptions, charters, and other non-literary documents used to check and illustrate the narratives and descriptions of literary historians. It was during this period that, for example, John Horsley of Morpeth in Northumberland had made the first systemic collection of Roman inscriptions in Britain, following the lead of Italian, French, and German scholars. This movement was very little noticed by philosophers. The only one of leading rank was much affected by it was I'm going to restart that sentence. The only one of leading rank who was much affected by it was Leibniz, who applied the new methods of historical scholarship to the history of philosophy with momentous results. We can even call him the modern founder of that study. He never wrote on it at length, but his work is everywhere permeated with the knowledge of ancient and medieval philosophical thought. And thus we owe to him the conception of philosophy as a continuous historical tradition in which new progress comes about not only by propounding completely new and revolutionary ideas, but by preserving and developing what he calls philosophia perennis, the permanent and unchanging truths which have always been known. This conception, of course, lays too much stress on the idea of permanence and too little on that of change. Philosophical truth is conceived too much as an unchanging deposit of eternal and external known verities, and too little as something always needing to be recreated by the effort of thought that transcends the past. But this is only a way of saying that Leibniz's conception of history characteristically belonged to a period when the relations between the permanent and the changing, between truths of reason and truths of fact, had not yet been clearly thought out. Leibniz remarks on rapprochement between the alienated spheres of philosophy and history, not yet an effective contact between them. Not yet an effective contact between them. In spite of this, strongly historically bent in Leibniz, and in spite of the brilliant work in which made Spinoza the founder of biblical criticism, and the general tendency of the Cartesian school was sharply anti-historical. It was precisely this fact that had led to the general downfall and discredit of Cartesianism. The powerful new movement of historical thought, growing up, as it were, under the ban of Cartesian philosophy, constituted, by its very existence, a refutation of that philosophy. And when the time came for a definite attack upon its principles, the persons who led that attack were naturally persons whose main constructive interest was in history. I shall give some account to two such attacks. Subsection 7. Anti-Cartesianism. Vico. The first is that of Vico, who was working in Naples in the early 18th century. The interest of Vico's work lies in the fact that he was in the first place a trained and brilliant historian, who set himself the task of formulating the principles of historical method as Bacon had formulated those of the scientific. And in the course of this constructive work, he found himself confronted by the Cartesian philosophy as something against which a polemic had been undertaken. He did not impugn the validity of mathematical knowledge, but he did impugn the Cartesian theory of knowledge with its implication that no other kind of knowledge was possible. Hence, he attacked the Cartesian principle that the criterion of truth is that the clear and distinct idea. He pointed out that, in effect, this was only a subjective or psychological criterion. The fact that I may think my ideas are clear and distinct only proves that I believe them, not that they are true. In saying this, Vico is substantially agreeing with Hume that belief is nothing but the vivacity of our own perceptions. Any idea, says Vico, however false, may convince us by its seeming self-evident. And nothing is easier to think our beliefs are self-evident when they in fact are baseless fictions reached by sophistical argument. That is sophistical. Once more, a Humean point. What we need, Vico contends, is a principle by which to distinguish what can be known from what cannot, a doctrine of the necessary limits of human knowledge. This, of course, brings Vico into line with Locke, whose critical empiricism was to supply a starting point for the other main attack on Cartesianism. Vico finds this principle in the doctrine of that verum et factum convertuntur, that is, the condition of being able to know anything truly, to understand it as opposed to merely perceiving it, is that the knower himself should have known it, should have made it. On this principle, nature is intelligible only to God, but mathematics is intelligible to man, because the objects of mathematical thought are fictions or hypotheses, which the mathematician has constructed. Any piece of mathematical thinking begins with a fiat. Let ABC be a triangle and let AB equal AC. It is because by this act of will that the mathematician makes the triangle. Because it is his factum that he can have true knowledge of it. This is not, in the ordinary sense of the word, idealism. The existence of the triangle does not depend on its being known. To know things is not to create them. On the contrary, nothing can be known unless it has already been created. Whether a given mind can know it depends on how it has been created. It follows from the verum factum principle that history, which is empirically something made by the human mind, is especially adapted to be an object of human knowledge. Vico regards the historical process as a process whereby human beings build up systems of language, custom, law, government, i.e., he thinks of history as the history of the genesis and development of human societies and their institutions. Here we reach for the first time a completely modern idea of what the subject matter of history is. There is no antithesis between the isolated actions of men and the divine plan that holds them together, as there was for the Middle Ages. And on the other hand, there is no suggestion that the primitive man, in whom Vico was peculiarly interested, foresaw what was going to come of the developments he was initiating. The plan of history is a wholly human plan, but it does not pre-exist in the shape of an unrealized intention to its own gradual realization. Man is no mere demiurge, fashioning human society as Plato's God fashions the world on an ideal model. Like God himself, he is a real creator, bringing into the existence both form and matter together in the corporate work of his own historical development. The fabric of human society is created by a man out of nothing, and every detail of this fabric is therefore a human factum, eminently knowable to the human mind as such. Vico here is giving us the results of his long and fruitful researches into history of such things as law and language. He has found that these researches are capable of yielding knowledge just as certain as the certain knowledge Descartes had ascribed to the results of mathematical and physical research. And he expresses the way in which knowledge has arisen by saying in effect that The historian can reconstruct in his own mind the process by which these things have been created by the men in the past. There is a kind of pre-established harmony between the historian's mind and the object which he sets out to study. But this pre-established harmony, unlike that of Leibniz, is not based on a miracle. It is based on the common human nature uniting the historian with the men whose work he is studying. This new attitude towards history is profoundly anti-Cartesian, because the whole structure of the Cartesian system was conditioned by a problem which in the world of history does not arise. The problem of skepticism, the problem of the relation between ideas and things. Descartes, starting his researches into the method of natural science from the skeptical point of view, which then prevailed in France, had to begin by assuring himself that there was really such a thing as the material world. For history was conceived by Vico as no such problem could exist. The skeptical point of view is impossible. History, for Vico, is not concerned with the past as past. It is concerned, in the first instance, with the actual structure of society that we live in, the manner and customs which we share with people around us. In order to study these, we do not need to ask whether they really exist. The question has no meaning. Descartes, looking at the fire, asked himself whether, in addition to his own idea of a fire, there also was a real fire. For Vico, looking at such a thing as the Italian language of his own day, no parallel question could arise. The distinction between the idea of such an historical reality and the historical reality itself would be meaningless. The Italian language is exactly what the people who use it think it is. For the historian, the human point of view is final. What God thinks about the Italian language is a question he need not ask, and which he knows he could not answer. Search for the thing in itself is for him as pointless as it is futile. And Descartes himself half recognized this when he said in the matters of morality, his rule was to accept the laws and institutions of the country in which he lived, and to govern his conduct according to the best opinions which he found commonly received around him, thus admitting that the individual could not construct these things for himself a priori, but must recognize them as historical facts pertaining to the society in which he lives. It is true that Descartes only adopts these rules provisionally, hoping that the time would come when he would be able to construct his own system of conduct on a metaphysical basis. But the time never did come, and the nature of the case never could. Descartes' hope was only one example of the exaggerated views he held about the possibilities of a priori speculation. History is a kind of knowledge in which questions about ideas and questions about facts are not distinguishable. And the whole point of Descartes' philosophy consists in distinguishing those two types of questions. With Vico's conception of history as a philosophical, justifiable form of knowledge, went a conception of historical knowledge as capable of far wider development. Once the historian answers the question how historical knowledge in general is possible, he can proceed to the solution of historical problems hitherto insoluble. This is done by forming a clear conception of historical thought and working out the rules which it obeys. Vico was peculiarly interested in what he called the history of remote and obscure periods, that is, an extension of historical knowledge. And in this connection, he laid down certain rules of method. First, he held that certain periods of history had a general character, coloring every detail which appeared in other periods, so that the two different periods might have the same general character, and it was possible to argue analogically from one to the other. He instanced the general resemblance between the Homeric period of Greek history and the European Middle Ages, both of which he called by the generic name of heroic periods. Their common features were such things as government by a warrior aristocracy and an agricultural economy. A ballad literature, a morality based on the idea of personal prowess and loyalty and so forth. To learn more than Homer can tell us about the Homeric age, therefore, we should study the Middle Ages and then see how far we can apply that to what we've learned there to early Greece. Secondly, he showed that these similar periods tended to reoccur in the same order. Every heroic period is followed by a classical period, where thought prevails over imagination, prose over poetry, industry over agriculture, and a morality based on peace over one based on war. This, in turn, is followed by a decline into a new barbarism, but a barbarism quite different from the heroic barbarism of the imagination. It is what he calls a barbarism of reflection, where thought still rules, but thought which has exhausted its power, its creative power, and only constructs meaningless networks of artificial and pedantic distinctions. Vico sometimes puts his cycle in the following way. First, the guiding principle of history is brute strength, then valiant or heroic strength, then valiant justice, then brilliant originality, then constructive reflection, and lastly, a kind of spendthrift and wasteful opulence which destroys what has been constructed. Basically what's happening now. That's not in the book, that's my comment. But he is quite aware that any such scheme is too rigid and not to admit of countless exceptions. Thirdly, this cyclical movement is not a mere rotation of history through a cycle of fixed phases. It is not a circle, but a spiral. For history never repeats itself, but comes around to each new phase in a form differentiated by what has gone before. Thus, the Christian barbarism of the Middle Ages is differentiated from the pagan barbarism of the Homeric age by everything that makes it distinctively an expression of the Christian mind. For this reason, because history is always creating novelties, the cyclical law does not permit us to forecast the future. And this distinguishes Vico's use of it from the old Greco-Roman idea of strictly circular movement in history, found, for example, in Plato, Polybus, and the Renaissance historians like Machiavelli and Campanella. And it brings us into line with the principle to whose fundamental importance I have already referred, that the true historian never prophesizes. Vico then goes on to enumerate certain prejudices against which historians have always to be on their guard, like the idols in Bacon's Novum Organum. He distinguishes 5 sources of error. 1. Magnificent opinions concerning antiquity, i.e., the prejudice in favor of exaggerating the wealth, power, grandeur, and of the period which the historian is studying. The principle which Vico here is especially expressing negatively is the principle that what makes a past period of history worth studying is not the intrinsic worth of its achievements taken by themselves, but its relation to the general course of history. The prejudice is a very real one. E.g., I find that people who are interested in Roman provincial civilization have a strong reluctance to believe, as I have proved from archaeological evidence, that the Roman London was only about 10,000 to 15,000 inhabitants. They would rather it have had 50 to 100,000, because they have a magnificent opinion concerning antiquity. 2. The conceit of nations. Every nation, in dealing with its own past history, has a prejudice in favor of painting it in the most favorable of colors. Histories of England, written for the English people, do not enlarge on military failures and so forth. 3. The conceit of the learned. This, Vico interprets it, takes the special form of a prejudice on part of the historian, which makes him suppose that the people about whom he is thinking were like himself in being scholars and students in general of the people of reflective intellect. The academic mind fancies that the person in whom it is interested in must have an academic persons themselves. Actually, Vico held, the most effective men in history have been the least academically minded. Historical greatness and reflective intellect are very rarely combined. The scale of value which governs the historian's own life is very different from that which governs the lives of his chief characters. 4. The fallacy of sources, or what Vico calls the scholastic succession of nations. This error consists in thinking that two nations have similar idea or institution. When two nations have a similar idea or institution, one must have learned it from the other. There's a lot of that in this is an aside note. There's a lot of that in Graham Hancock where he's like, oh, look at all these civilizations that have very similar stuff. Obviously, they came from the same source. That is the fallacy that I'm talking about right now, the fallacy of sources. And Vico shows that it depends on denying the original creative power of the human mind, which can rediscover ideas for itself without learning them from another. He is quite right to warn historians against this fallacy, in point of fact, where it is certain that one nation has taught another, as China has taught Japan, Greece, Rome, Gaul, and so on, the learner invariably learns not what the other has to teach, but only the lessons for which its previous historical development has prepared it. 5. Lastly, there is the prejudice of thinking that the ancients are better informed than ourselves about the times that lay near to them. Actually, to take an example, that is not one of Vico's. Wait, restart this sentence. Actually, to take the example that is not one of Vico's, the scholar of King Alfred's time knew much less about the Anglo-Saxon origins than we do. Vico's warning against this prejudice is of the great importance because, when developed on its positive side, it becomes a principle that the historian does not depend on an unbroken tradition for his knowledge, but can reconstruct by scientific methods a picture of the past age which he does not derive from any tradition whatsoever. This is the explicit denial that history depends on what Bacon called memory, or in the other words of the statements of authorities. Vico is not content with the negative warnings. He goes on positively to indicate certain methods by which the historian can transcend mere reliance on the statements of authorities. His observations here are commonplace to the historian of today, but in his own time they were revolutionary. 1. He shows that how linguistic study can throw light on history. Etymology can show what kind of life a people was leading whilst language was coming into existence. The historian is aiming at a reconstruction of the mental life, the ideas of the people he is studying. Their stock of words shows what their stock of ideas was, and in the way which they use an old word metaphorically in a new sense, when they want to express a new idea. This shows what their stock ideas was before that new one came into existence. Thus, Latin words like intelligere and discere show how the Romans needed words for understanding and discussing. They borrowed from an agricultural vocabulary the words for gleaning and sowing. 2. He makes a similar use of mythology. The gods of primitive religion represent a semi-poetical way of expressing the social structure of the people who invented them. Thus, in Greco-Roman mythology, Vico saw a representation of the domestic, economic, and political life of the ancients. These myths were the way in which a primitive and imaginative mind expressed to itself what a more reflective mind would have stated in codes of law and morality. 3. He propounds a new method, strange as its novelty may appear to us, of using tradition, by taking it not as the literal true, but as a confused memory of facts distorted through a medium of whose refractive index we can to a certain extent define. All traditions are true, but none of them mean what they say. In order to discover what they mean, we must know what kind of people invented them, and what such a kind of people would have meant by saying that kind of thing. 4. In order to find the key to this reinterpretation, we must remember that the minds at a given stage of development will tend to create the same kinds of products. Savages at all times and all places are savages in mind. By studying the modern savages, we can, sounds kind of off, by studying modern savages, we can learn what ancient savages were like, and thus find out how to interpret the savage myths and legends that conceal the facts of remotest ancient history. Children are savages of a kind. The children's fairy tales may help in the same direction. Modern peasants are unreflective and imaginative persons, and in their idea to throw light on the ideas of primitive society and so forth. To sum up, Vico has done two things. First, he has used to the full the advance in critical method which had been achieved by historians of the late 17th century, and carried this process a stage farther by showing how historical thought can be constructive as well as critical, cutting it loose from its dependence on written authorities and making it genuinely original or self-dependent, able to recover by scientific analysis of data truths which have been completely forgotten. Secondly, he has developed the philosophical principles implicit in his historical work up to a point where he can deliver a counterattack on the scientific and metaphysical philosophy of Cartesianism, demanding a broader basis for the theory of knowledge and criticizing the narrowness and abstractness of the prevailing philosophical creed. Actually, he was too far ahead of his time to have very much immediate influence. The extraordinary merit of this work was not recognized until 2 generations later. German thought has reached it on its own account a point much akin to his own. Through the great blossoming of historical studies which took place in Germany in the late 18th century, when that happened, German scholars rediscovered Vico and attached a great value to him, and thus exemplified his own doctrine that ideas are propagated not by diffusion, like articles of commerce, but by the independent discovery of each nation of which it needs at any given stage in its own development. And that brings us up to subsection 8. We're at page 71 of R.G. Collingwood's The Idea of History. And now I'm going to read the comments. If you are listening to the audio book thing that I'm doing here, skip to the next video. I'm just going to read and answer any comments that are up here. Someone said, shush, someone whose name is your mother. That's hilarious. Hello, Mr. Apananda. Hi, nobody. What's up, Shafarul? Dope name. Sam. Interesting. What's up, Cash? And hello, Just Witty. And Andrew Q. If you want to see my feet, you're going to have to pay me a lot of money. Because it says here on the comments thing, let's see them feet. But anyways, how y'all doing today? I think that more people should read, but if you can't read or don't have time, listen to some books. Scribd, or Everand, I guess the app is called now, is a great resource. Also LibriVox, YouTube as well. I have a series that I'm doing, I guess, on these. If you want to start from the beginning, find the first video. Then you can listen to the book from the beginning, because I start from the introduction and just keep going. I'm at page 70, which is, well, it's a 300-page book. I'm almost a third the way through. And then next, I want to read more philosophical works. So I'm debating on whether I want to read Kant, or if I want to, because I have Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. I read that a long time ago. It fried my brain. It's hard to, his language, the way he constructs language is really hard for me to kind of parse out. It's either that or I got some Plato. I might finish Aristotle's on rhetoric. That might be a good one to do. But yeah, that's after I do this. So it's taken me, 7 days to even get to page 70. So it's going to take 30 days to finish this book. After this month, I guess, we'll start on some new books. Oh, I never said I was smart. The whole, to answer Mr. Orzinkla, it says you're not that smart just because you read Plato. Yeah, I don't think that I'm smart. I'm working on my intelligence. That's why I'm reading. Because I want to be smart, and I hate being dumb. It really sucks being dumb. because it just screws you over in life. So the best way to gain knowledge is through experience and through reading other people's experiences and reflecting on their work. Um, but yeah, I don't just have Plato. I got other stuff. I got Spinoza. I could read that. Read his Spinoza's Ethics, which I mean it has to do with a little bit with ethics, but it also has a lot of weird stuff to do. So other things. What else do I got? But yeah, it's either that or. See, I also agree that with the fact that reading Plato doesn't make you smart. Thank you. I've been told that I look like Shaggy most of my life. You should have seen what I looked like when I had long hair. But I agree that not necessarily reading philosophy will make you a smart person, because there are some philosophical works that, you know, they have a great system. Does that make it true? No. It's just someone's ideas. But in order to find the truth, or find truth, I guess, you have to hear a lot of different descriptions and test them against each other. I got some other books here too. I might read instead, because like I don't have really any fiction. I mostly have religious texts, and I don't mean Christian. And then philosophy, and then I got like a collection of Mark Twain that someone gave me. I got a lot of art books, but the problem is with that is yeah, I agree. It feels just like a story. Oh man, Svel K994. I don't know. I've never found it. But yeah. I might do the Austin Osman Spare book next, but we'll see. A lot of Plato is nice, but like at the same time, you can't just. Oh, it's this one guy. Oh my God, they're so smart. Don't just take everything they say as true, you know. Check everything, you know. Be reasonable. Think things through. But I also have Heidegger's Being in Time, and then I found out about Heidegger, and then I went, oh, okay. I'm still gonna read that book though, but after learning about some of his ideas, kind of weird. That, and I also might just go through some. I've got Nothingness and Being in Nothingness too. That's a good book. I might do that one later, but I gotta go now because I got shit to do. So I gotta go to work. Peace out, y'all. Have a great day.